Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Upper Keys BPW online event tonight. We have the title of this virtual event is How to Advocate Effectively at the State Level, and our speaker is Emma Haydocy, who's the Florida Policy Manager at the Surfrider Foundation. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words about BPW and about policy and policy advocacy. This past Tuesday was election day just about everywhere else in the country, I think, except for here in Florida, or at least in Monroe County. We didn't have any reason to go to our polling place today. But it's great that we're having this session today because it's a good reminder that even when we're not doing our homework on candidates and issues in preparation for voting, we really need to keep ourselves learning and up to date about policies that can help working women in our communities, our families, our professions, and our health. The Upper Keys Business and Professional Women, or BPW, is a nonpartisan organization that serves working women holistically at every stage of their lives. And we have what we like to think is a unique combination of activities that, number one, serve personal support and connection, like our speed networking luncheon that's going to be held in Isla Mirada next Wednesday. And if you haven't signed up for that yet, I hope you do. So we try to connect people, number one. Number two, we support working women through professional development, making opportunities like this available for learning. We're having a wonderful digital design workshop that will be held in person in January. So keep your eyes open for that one. And the third pillar of it is really policy advocacy. When it comes to advocacy, we look to the BPW Florida policy platform as a blueprint for our work in respect, justice, and equality for working women. BPW Florida has a platform that reviews every year, and we discuss it here in the Upper Keys, and local organizations across the state join in a statewide discussion to make sure that our policy platform reflects women's evolving needs and concerns. The 2023-2024 BPW Florida Public Policy Platform includes 3 items. Number one, economic equity, opportunity, and self-sufficiency. Number 2, healthcare. And number 3, voting rights and access. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of details and important points under each one of those items. I encourage you to visit our state website, bpwfl.org, for more information about those. Don't do it right now because we want your attention on the webinar, but please go there later and look into all the details. But, you know, working women, we're all a little bit different. So all of these issues hit us in a different way. We've got different experiences. They're by no means the only policy areas that affect women, but they're a great place to start if you're interested in advocacy to support working women. So with that little refresher, I hope you'll enjoy this evening's presentation, which I think is going to be helpful whether you're interested in getting involved with BPW's advocacy issues or whatever issues may be impacting you, your family, and your work right now. And we've got a great expert here with us. Emma Haydocy, as I mentioned, is the Florida Policy Manager with the Surfrider Foundation, where she represents the interests of the National Ocean Protection nonprofit in Tallahassee and in Washington, D.C. She also supports a grassroots network of 11 Surfrider chapters in Florida as they work to enact change in our local communities. And here in the Upper Keys, we're delighted. You can see the work of Surfrider members in our beaches, in our communities, and in the kind of conversations that they make sure we're having. Emma's also been a BPW member with us since 2020. And she's served on our public policy committee, most recently during the very active campaign period that we had last year when we hosted a number of events for candidates for local office to talk to us and answer questions. Hailing from Massachusetts, Emma has long served as an advocate and nonprofit professional, working to ensure economic justice, affordable housing, and healthy ecosystems. Her passion for conservation and policy were fostered at Warren Wilson College, where she studied history and political science. In her spare time, she enjoys getting pulled around Florida Bay chasing fish and exploring our beautiful home in the Florida Keys. So with that, please join me in welcoming Emma to talk to us, and take it away, Emma.
Thank you, Jill. I am going to take a second, that awkward moment where I have to screen share and ensure that you all can see my screen. Can we see? Great. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that great introduction, Jill. I'm delighted to be here with my home LO for this presentation this evening. As Jill mentioned, my presentation is entitled How to Advocate Effectively at the State Level. And what I hope is imparted this evening with all of you is a lot of kind of background need to know information, so that as the state legislative kicks off on January 9th, you have some semblance of an idea of what is going to be happening up there and how you can engage in the process. I'll also note that while we are talking explicitly about state advocacy this evening, this really could be applied to any and all level of governmental decision, local, state, or federal level. It's not just what's happening in Tallahassee, but it's what's happening on local school boards, at your village or city council or commission meeting, and even all the way up in Washington, D.C. So to get us kicked off, I know that this is a BPW-centric event this evening, but I do just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about Surfrider and my role. So this mission of the Surfrider Foundation, we are dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean, waves, and beaches for all people through a powerful activist network. I have the distinctive pleasure and privilege to be able to represent Surfrider's interests in Tallahassee, as Jill mentioned, but our network is working to engage in policy change on the federal level, and all of our 11 chapters in Florida are working to enact local changes that improve our local beaches and waterways in our communities. And we're going to start off with a very basic overview of what is lobbying, because it can mean a couple of different things depending on how you are engaging with it. So in general, lobbying is to influence or sway toward a desired action, or to get something that you want by talking to decision makers. And while that is the basic definition, there are a couple of different buckets of lobbying that we talk about. They have very distinctive definitions, and there are federal and state limitations to the amount of those activities that nonprofits can engage in. I'm limited by that in my work, and I'm sure that BPW is in certain ways as well, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But grassroots lobbying is when you ask the public or your membership or your community to persuade a decision maker to make a specific decision about a specific piece of legislation. And I'll just note that these are all examples, but this could mean Jill sending out an action alert asking the members to support and send a message to a state rep about leave bill or an equal rights bill. Federal and state limitations do apply here, and the same goes for direct lobbying. So in grassroots lobbying, I'm asking you to advocate with somebody on a specific issue. Direct lobbying removes the middleman of that community member, and it's when I directly ask a decision maker to vote in a particular way on a specific piece of legislation. An example would be if Patricia met with the senator and asked them to vote yes on a paid parental leave bill in a specific committee. Again, federal and state limitations can apply to these activities. And then finally, we have advocacy. And this is the more general promotion of an idea through education. There are not limitations on advocacy, but you do want to be very clear that what you are doing is not advocacy versus grassroots or direct lobbying. This would be, for example, going up to Tallahassee to talk about the importance of paid parental leave. There's not a specific bill we're asking to vote on. It's a concept that we are trying to educate the legislator about. So more broad issue advocacy versus asking for a specific action on a specific piece of legislation. Oh, skipped ahead. This is a very general slide. This is what we tell all of our chapters, because our network engages in state houses across the country and with local governments throughout the country. So Local, state, and federal lobbying laws do vary. And so what I would suggest consulting with your LO or with BPW Florida before going to engage in any lobbying activities on behalf of BPW. I'm not familiar with what the rules and laws are for y'all, but I know that you are the experts and they should be consulting with you. And I did also want to give a very brief overview of the Florida legislature. We are going to do a little bit of schoolhouse rock tonight together in talking about both the composition, basic terminology that you might see, and how you can track bills of interest. So basic overview, 160 members of the state legislature, 40 senators, 120 members of the House. And every year, the legislature meets for a period not to exceed 60 days, and that is what we refer to as the legislative session. That does not preclude the legislature and members from meeting to discuss other topics. In fact, we saw an example of that this week. The legislature can and does frequently call special sessions when there are specific items that they would like to pass legislation around. This week, the legislature met. It was a regularly scheduled committee week, which I will talk about in just a second. However, due to the impacts of Hurricane Idalia and the desire to pass legislation related to property insurance and Israel, the legislature convened to consider a handful of bills for passage this week that are already being sent to the governor's desk. And we saw that, I will say, as well in 2022 in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, when the need to pass funding packages and support impacted communities is urgent. Each House member is given 8 bill slots, and there is no limit for senators. So if you are a member of the House, you can only file 8 pieces of legislation per session. Senators can file messaging bills and are not limited in what they have to file. I did not note on here, but in case you did not know, your state senator is Ana Maria Rodriguez, and your state House member is State Representative Jim Mooney. I did want to flag leadership and changes that are upcoming. Currently, the president of the Senate is Kathleen Pasadomo, who's out of Naples, and the Speaker of the House is Paul Renner. That is changing. We did just approve the president-elect, who is Ben Albritton. He's out of Punta Gorda, and the incoming speaker is Danny Perez, who's out of Miami, which I think is actually going to be a benefit for those of us who live in some of the southernmost counties in the state. All right, I'm not going to hang on to this for too long, but this is how a bill becomes a law in Florida. And just to flag where we're at in the process right now. So I know I mentioned that January 9th is the beginning of the regular session, but members have been convening for what we call committee weeks. This is the time when bills can be filed and put into drafting. Actually, the drafting deadline is coming up next week. But bills are put into drafting and committee meetings are hosted. So as a part of the legislature, members are assigned to committees that are subject-based. This can be anything from banking and insurance to agriculture and the environment. And those committees vet or hear bills before they are voted on. During this time of year, there's not a lot of legislation that's being heard by these committees, and typically they are hearing from state agencies about their budget requests and environmental priorities for the year. To put this into a verbal visual form, which helps me, especially because that map is a little chaotic. If we're talking about how a bill becomes a law, after it is drafted, it is filed and given a number. It has to be read 3 times. It is referenced to committees. It is heard in those committees. I will flag that getting put on an agenda is a significant part of the process and half the battle with a lot of legislation. There are thousands of bills that are filed every year, and only several handfuls that end up becoming law at the end of session. And part of that battle is getting it onto all 3 of those committee agendas. Those committee chairs are gatekeepers and incredible targets oftentimes to be able to get something heard. So it has to get on the agenda and it has to pass out of each committee favorably before it is voted on the House or Senate floor. A lot of times bills are identical, but sometimes in drafting, there are some differences. So if there are any differences between the House and Senate versions, which by the way, you do need to have a House and Senate bill or companion for either of those for the bill to have any chance of success, goes to conference, issues are ironed out, there's a final vote, and it is then at some point between the end of session and those 2 months afterwards, it has to be signed by the governor. He can sign it, he can veto it, or he cannot sign it. And if it is not signed, it will not be enacted and it will quietly fall out of the way. If you are interested in tracking bills, it is actually not difficult to be able to follow legislation that you find to be important. I will say that this image on the screen is horribly antiquated. But however, the website links are still the same, active and good. myfloridahouse.gov and flsenate.gov both offer free bill tracking. So once you know that you have an issue that you're interested in, or you see that paid parental leave bill or that healthcare bill that you would like to follow and see if it's progressing or not, you can sign up to track. And literally any and every update, almost exhaustively, will be sent to your computer so you know when it's put on an agenda, when it's going to be heard, if there were any amendments filed, if it was temporarily postponed or withdrawn, which we'll talk about in just a second. But you'll get all the progress that you need to stay informed throughout the session. Couple of key terms and acronyms, especially when we talk about government, it is alphabet soup. And so there are a lot of different acronyms that you'll see thrown out there. I think most of them should be pretty straightforward. But a committee substitute, bills, when they're introduced, are not perfect. And there are a lot of ideas that come from other members about how those bills can be altered, either for better or worse. I like to say in my world of environmental policy in Florida that oftentimes we're in the business of harm mitigation. And so the committee and amendment process can be really helpful in trying to make really bad things not so bad, or even trying to improve good pieces of legislation that could be better. So a committee substitute is when it goes through the committee process and can be subject to numerous amendments. Once it is rewritten, it becomes a committee substitute. A companion bill, as I alluded to earlier, it's a bill introduced in one house that's identical or similar to a bill introduced in the other. General bill of general statewide interest. PCS, proposed committee substitute, is a little bit different. This is before all of those amendments are before those amendments are passed. It's the proposed changes to that bill, temporarily postponed or TP'd. It's postponing of consideration of an agenda bill. This can happen for various reasons. It can be leadership doesn't like the bill. It can be, oh my gosh, we realized that we didn't talk to this stakeholder or constituent group, and now we realize this is a horrible bill. It can be temporarily postponed or even withdrawn. Now I want to talk a little bit about why we lobby and why it's important for all of us as constituents in our local communities, on the state level, on the federal level, why it's important for us to show up and lobby. And on a very basic level, meeting with elected officials is about enacting changes and policies that we want to see in our communities. These are the governing bodies, these are the decision makers who have the power to enact those policies that impact our daily lives. In the context of Surfrider, we are often talking about all of our campaign work, and so we meet with them to influence campaign or policy outcomes. But I also wanted to make a note that oftentimes it can be that advocacy bucket where really we're there to educate electeds about, for example, BPW, our priorities and our programs. We may not have a specific piece of legislation, but fostering those relationships as frequently as possible is a way to ensure that when there is a bill on the table that is important to you, that you are acknowledged for your expertise and consulted with on those specific issues. It really is all about establishing rapport and building relationships, both with legislators and with staff. I will underscore the staff piece on my next slide. But ultimately, we're trying to empower legislative champions for the issues that are important to us. And that starts with meeting them where they're at, either up on their respective hill or when we're back at home in district. Okay, so why this matters? Because it takes a really long time. I think that the caveat to this is obviously in the local level where we can see ordinances or planning or management decisions happening within a month or two. It can take one meeting to change the policy landscape. But when we're talking about state or federal legislation, it can take years to become laws. And that's why it's really important that you not only know your legislator's name, but they know your name. When folks enter into elected office, they are not experts in every subject area. They typically have expertise and some background in maybe one or two issue areas, but they certainly cannot cover and understand and the nuance of every single issue that comes before their desk. And so they are looking for resources. They are looking for folks who they can trust with reliable and factual information so that when they do make that vote, they know that the BPW is supportive of this and concept. I will say, I've seen this, in practice in my work. An example, I think most recently is that we work to ensure that there is not plastic littering our beaches. And so we've worked now for 2 years with a Republican member in the House on a bill that repeals the intentional release of balloons in Florida, which you are actually allowed to do. And so we worked with this woman. And then this past year, when I met with her, she said, listen, I'm carrying this big agency bill on all of the environmental updates that the agency is looking to do. And I'd love for you to be able to read through it and let me know what you think before filing it. And so because we've established this relationship, she's now coming to Surfrider and consulting with us to ask us as the experts if this is good, sound environmental policy or not. And if so, how it can be changed. Another flag on relationships, which I think is general relationship building 101, but if you're going to oppose something, one of these folks are going to do, let them know before you go to the weekly or to the free press and start talking about how horrific that piece of legislation was. First of all, it is one sure way to burn down every bridge you have with that member. But it also can be a great opportunity to find some compromise. I always come to the table with solutions ready and compromise ready to suggest, because typically they will ask, well, I can't withdraw this bill, but is there something that I could change about it that would make it a little bit better? And marginal progress is progress in our book in particular. And then finally, the composition of a legislature changes. As Jill alluded to, we have an election cycle coming up very soon. And so there are going to be changes in what the legislature looks like and what our local town councils look like and what Congress looks like. However, staff often say the same. These folks are in it for the long haul. So you have legislative aides and staffers, agency staff, committee staff, all who you can forge relationships with who are going to be in Tallahassee long after their bosses are. And another personal story on this one for me was yet another bill sponsor who we worked with last year. Her staffer moved from her office to the incoming Speaker of the House, who I now know that I can text to talk about water quality and environmental issues, and I hope is going to be a huge asset in having the speaker's ear over the next couple of years to come on our respective issues. So it does matter to build those relationships with staff. Now, I do want to talk about best practices for effective lobbying anywhere. As I said, I know that everybody here may not be headed up to Tallahassee, but I know that you likely have engaged with your city council, with the county commission. And so these are just some general best practices that I think are helpful when you are getting ready to meet with an elected official. It's really good and actually I think required to do your homework before you set out. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have met with even fellow staff or colleagues or volunteers or local community members who talk about an issue that's happening at the federal level, but they want to talk to their state elected official about it, or vice versa. We want to know where this decision is being made. Is it happening in Congress on the Hill in DC? Is it happening in Tallahassee? Or is it happening on the county commission? While this is not a part of local work, committees are a big part of state and federal legislative work. And so understanding what committees are going to be hearing the issues that you are going to be working on is imperative, because you will probably have to target them as well. And then understanding your targets. Who are those decision makers? Who are House and Senate leadership? Who are the chairs, those gatekeepers of those committees? And furthermore, who sit on those committees who are ultimately going to vote on that piece of legislation? You also want to know who your champs are. And then the asterisk is who can become one. You know, if I provide, as I'll talk about, more information, public testimony, public cover, what are the things that we can help provide to bolster and facilitate champions on the issues that we're working on? And then finally, when is the vote happening? Understanding timelines is so key, but like you may be talking about something that we had a committee meeting about yesterday and we've moved on to a whole new committee. The process moves fast, but that's why that bill tracking tool in particular for state stuff is super helpful, because you will get an alert basically as soon as there's any change. So knowing when that's happening is also of the utmost importance. This is more broadly kind of grassroots, talking about campaign planning. I didn't want to harp on this too much, but if you are looking to get more into policy, being able to really sit down and plan out your course of action to create that policy change or that ultimate policy goal that you're looking to achieve is really important. Surfrider has a ton of great resources on this. I don't want to spend a ton of time, but I will just say it is really important to find other ways besides meeting with elected officials, but typically meeting with elected officials is a key element of any successful policy campaign that folks are going to be working on. Now, let's get to the good stuff of how we meet with our elected officials, because again, it doesn't just have to be in Tallahassee. And frankly, I do have to say, it is, I think, so much more effective to meet with electeds outside of legislative session. They have like a couple more brain cells to hang on to because they're not being pulled in every single direction and having to worry about how they're voting. Actually, after this session, they will be in full election mode. However, it's really easy and much more convenient to hang out, for example, here in the Keys at one of the district offices than going all the way up to Tallahassee. So if you go onto the Florida Senate and House websites and you look up your senator, they have all this great information that you guys can see on the screen, which includes contacts, and the names of the legislative aides and staffers who you can contact to schedule a meeting. I can't underscore enough how easy it is to set up meetings at home. And oftentimes it can be really nice to even invite them out in the field. So like we love to do legislative field trips. We go out and give you a tour of our Blue Water Task Force labs, or invite them to a beach cleanup in the example of Surfrider, to give them an experiential way to understand the work that we're doing and why we advocate for the issues that we advocate for. And same goes for Tallahassee. The same staffers that are on here, sometimes they split up their duties a little differently, but you reach out to them about scheduling in Tally or at home as well. Again, not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but this is all just to say that in-person live interactions, personalized emails, personal phone calls are some of the most effective ways to reach legislators. I know Surfrider totally sends out action alerts, but the personal interactions, again, meeting them in person in office, sending their staffer a personal email that's not just a form email. When you do send those action alerts, it can be really tempting to like fill your name, first name, last, and send the message. But if you take the time to personalize it a little bit, it is more likely to be seen and acknowledged and recognized by those folks when they are up in office and getting barrages of emails every single day. Now we can get into some more best practices for meetings. And again, some of this is more practically about what you're doing in a live meeting. Be on time. This is like, I think basic. This is a Jill Keener rule. But I think it's super important to also communicate when you're not going to be on time. when you're scheduling that meeting, it's super important that you have a phone number and email for the staffer or the office that you're meeting with. Things can get crazy when you are running around from meeting to meeting, and a quick text or email can make all the difference to ensure that the 15 minutes that you're likely to get, and that is true. Typically, the meetings that we have with legislators are 10 to 15 minute intervals, and so we have to be punctual and effective in our messaging. Dress to impress. I don't think that I have to say this too much to the BPW crowd, but I do often have to say it to my volunteers at Surfrider, because we are definitely a more casual organization. I spend a lot of Zoom meetings in a t-shirt with no makeup on, and sometimes me opening Zoom is the first time I've looked at myself all day, but that is not the case when I go to Tallahassee. We always want to ensure that we're respecting the office that we're meeting with and that our appearance reflects that. Have literature in your request in writing. Again, sometimes meetings get missed. You know, especially if it's during session, they've got to go vote on the floor. They can't meet with you. And so you always want to have a packet. I have a packet with my priorities, talking points, a card, some information about Surfrider, and something pretty that I can deliver to them to talk about our priorities in the event that we can't meet, and to reinforce so that if I'm meeting with a staffer, they can meet with their boss later and talk about how they met with Surfrider and provide them all the information that they have. Be knowledgeable about the issue, but don't worry about knowing everything. I will always say that it is way more important to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you, than to misrepresent the facts in a meeting. And in fact, that I don't know, I'll get back to you is often a great window of opportunity to be able to keep the communication going with that member. And I know we talked about general advocacy, but it is really nice if you have specific requests. And I tried to make these a little bit more, well, some of them a little bit more general, but those requests could be, please co-sponsor this bill. Please put this bill on your committee agenda if they're a committee chair. Please ask the Speaker of the House or the Senate President to support this issue. But it also could be something like, please fund the town after school program. That could be a specific request that you're making when you're meeting with a lawmaker. Please fully fund this after school program. Please fully fund the rehabilitation of the soccer field. It could be really anything, but having a specific request is always helpful. If you're not saying, I don't know, I'll follow up, always follow up anyway with a thank you note. This can be virtual via email, although I will say I've had some great volunteers who paint cards and we'll send those. And I think it's such a lovely, nice touch to do that. And then a one-pager. So including that on an email just so they can harken back to it if they need to. And then, like I said, invite them out in the field, invite them in district to learn more when they are home and they have more bandwidth to be able to talk. Things we don't do. I think in general, whining is a horrible thing to do in any interaction, definitely not when you're in the meeting with a legislator. Don't threaten them. And then also, I mean, this is just in general, Surfrider is a nonpartisan organization. We're not in the business of making endorsements. And so we never want to threaten to endorse or not endorse somebody based off of the decision that they're going to make based off of your communication. We don't want to misrepresent facts or malign the opposition. And then I think the last two are particularly important. I'll just note, you know, we come to this work from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives and life experiences. And I will say personally that I can find it challenging at times to walk into a meeting with somebody who I know has voted to dehumanize groups of people who I know and love. And so it can be really difficult sometimes to put that aside and focus on the issue at hand. But I think that's one of the most important things or pieces of advice that I can give is that, you know, regardless of what side of the aisle or perspective they're coming from, you know, I go into every meeting hoping that we can come out with some common ground. And hopefully that's common ground on my side of things, but to find where we do have that common ground and work together to advance those priorities. It may not be every issue. In fact, it's often not every issue that I come to the table with, but I just think that's important to flag given the political landscape that we are operating in at times here in Florida. And then we don't want to burn bridges. And I think if you do not do any of the above, that you will be working towards not burning any bridges, because that will totally close off any and all communication you might have with that person. And just a reminder that influencing change requires positive, trusting, long-term relationships. All right, just checking on time. All right, some quick tips on navigating the conversation. I think, as I've underscored already, knowing your audience and doing your research in advance is so important. You can go onto the Senate website, the House website, and look up specific members, and it will tell you the bills they've sponsored. And if there is a specific piece of legislation from last session or years past that you were particularly interested in, you can actually look back to see how each member voted on that. And if folks had any questions on how to do that, I'd be happy to follow up elsewhere. But you can look up how they voted, you can look up the bills they've sponsored, and have an understanding of how they might vote on specific items. If they seem supportive, help them become a champion. Ask them what they need, whether it's resources, information, or support. We get a lot of folks who are like, yes, I love the water, but they have never sponsored a piece of water quality legislation, or they have never really taken that up specifically. So find out what they need to become champs. If they are opposed, I always think it's best to pivot and move on. You can always go back home and really dig into their argument on your own. I often am like emailing members of my team being like, hey, I heard this crazy conspiracy theory about plastic today. Can you help me debunk that? And so, there's time to go back and kind of look at their arguments and see if there's opportunities to be able to sway them. But typically in live, in person, pivot, move on, see if you can find common ground elsewhere. And then if they're undecided, ask them what they need to become a supporter. When I have somebody who says, I don't know how we feel about this, my next question is, okay, well, what do you need to know to make a decision? And they can, sometimes they still are pretty vague, but typically it's like, I need more information. Oftentimes it's, I need to check with leadership, but find out what they need. Sometimes it's public cover, testimony, or more information. Again, map out the discussion and talking points ahead of time. You should have a game plan before you go into every meeting. You know who you're meeting with and what committees they sit on, but know the bio, understand who they are. And then when it comes to lobbying in a group, because it sounds like there might be a lobby day coming up for BPW, oftentimes we're broken up into delegations or groups, and you kind of have to self-assign and figure out whose role is what, like who's going to be introducing BPW Florida. If you're there with your LO, who's going to introduce your activities locally. You always want a note taker so that you can refer back to that later. That's often a great person who maybe is like not super excited about speaking publicly. Typically by the end of all of your meetings, they are so excited to talk, but having somebody who can take notes on how the conversation went is super helpful. And then who's covering what talking points and who's making the ask. I left up the ABT. This is Surfrider's storytelling framework, and but therefore. We just use this as a way to kind of frame our asks and our stories. And oftentimes this is like the best framework that we have for crafting the ask and our stories that we tell during these meetings. Totally have resources on that. I'd be happy to share afterwards. And so as we wrap up, I want to talk about the long game. As I said, many bills take years and years to pass. And it really does take gentle pressure, relentlessly applied. I consider myself to be a relentless Pollyanna. And despite, having a lot of challenges on environmental issues, and seeing a lot of bad stuff happen in the past, I do know that there are a lot of champions that we have on both sides of the aisle who are working to try and push these issues up front and center. And they can't ignore an issue that won't go away. And I always say with the environment, like it's not, we're going to continue to have these issues. And I think you could say that across the board. But, even if you have a challenging meeting, I think that it's important to just continue advocating and educating and meeting folks where they're at until we see that desired result, and then voting too when that doesn't work. All right, that's my final slide. And I'll can move out of here for a second, but I did just want to drop a few links and my contact information. Those are the House and Senate websites. I do have some Surfrider chapter net resources. I don't know how helpful that is to this body here, but I'll just say Surfrider is very lucky to have a wealth of resources about how to effectively lobby and meet with elected officials and plan campaigns. And I know that you guys have a wonderful Surfrider member here who's with us tonight for our local chapter, who might be willing to share if there were interest from some folks here. But that wraps it up, I think, almost perfectly on time. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I think Jill's gonna hit stop recording.
Yeah, that's great. First, I want to give a big round of applause before we stop the recording to say thank you, Emma, for that great presentation. And this recording will be made available shortly on our BPW YouTube channel and other places, along with other resources.